One morning in 1590, a ship finally reached the English colony of Roanoke. The plan was simple: resupply the settlers, bring back news, and prove England could actually survive in the New World. But when the crew stepped onto the island, the village was silent. Homes had been destroyed. Even the people, every last one of them, were gone. This wasn't a small group either. We're talking over 100 settlers, entire families, mothers and children. Yet oddly, they didn't leave a trail, and there were no signs of violence. Just a single word carved into wood: CROATOAN, the only clue left behind. 4 centuries later, no one has figured out exactly what happened. Did they join with local tribes, or worse, were they wiped out? By the summer of 1587, a group of English settlers were on their way across the ocean. Families. Over 100 men, women and children set sail from Plymouth in May, all packed into 3 small ships. The plan, at least on paper, was to build a settlement up in Chesapeake Bay, but things rarely go the way they're planned. Leading the expedition was John White. He wasn't a soldier or nobleman, but an artist who had travelled on earlier voyages. Sir Walter Raleigh, one of Queen Elizabeth's closest favourites, and the man funding England's push into the New World, trusted him enough to make him governor, even though White's main skills involved drawing, not governing. Still, he accepted, and off they went. On board was his own daughter Eleanor, who was pregnant during the trip, and her husband Ananias Dare. This journey wasn't just another attempt to grab land. This was supposed to be the start of a real community, with families planting roots in the New World. The journey took about 2 months, and by July the ships reached the outer banks of what's now North Carolina. They anchored at Hatteras, and White's plan was to go check on the men Sir Richard Grenville had left at Roanoke a year earlier. For a little bit of context, Grenville had commanded an earlier expedition in 1585, landing a group of about 100 men to establish a small English base on the island. Supplies ran short, tensions with the local tribes grew, and most of those men were eventually taken back to England by Sir Francis Drake. But Grenville, stubborn about not letting the colony look like a total failure, had left behind a force of about 15 men to hold the fort until reinforcements arrived. By the time White showed up in 1587, he wanted to check whether any of those soldiers were still around. When White and his men went to look for Grenville's 15 men, the scene was grim. They didn't find a settlement. They found bones. Only one of the men could even be identified. And according to White's notes, he had been killed by savages long before. That discovery didn't exactly set a hopeful tone for the new colony. Still, the settlers moved ahead. They repaired the old cottages left behind from the 1585 expedition and built a few new ones. On August 18th, Eleanor gave birth to a daughter, Virginia Dare. She was the very first English child born in the Americas. For a moment, it must have felt like a new beginning. Life, though, was far from easy. Relations with the native tribes quickly turned complicated. George Howe, one of the assistants, was out by the water one afternoon, catching crabs when he was attacked and killed by Roanoke Indians. The colonists reacted fast. White, Captain Stafford, and 24 men went looking for payback. But in their rush, they made a huge mistake. They attacked CROATOAN Indians who were actually allies and had nothing to do with Howe's death. The CROATOANs were only gathering corn and fruit at a nearby village when the English charged in. Luckily for the settlers, Manteo stepped in. Manteo was a member of the Croatan people, and he had actually sailed to England years earlier with an earlier expedition. While there, he learned the language, met English leaders, and built trust with men like Raleigh and White. So, he helped smooth things over, reminding his own people that the English had attacked by mistake. Because of his loyalty, White and the others decided to honour him. On August 13th, they baptised him as a Christian and even gave him the title of Lord of Roanoke and Dasamongaponke. Even with Manteo's help, the colony was soon in real trouble. It was late August, which meant no time to plant crops. Their food stores were thin, they had no animals, and not even enough salt to keep what food they did have preserved. Everyone knew they needed more supplies and more people to back them up. The settlers finally convinced John White that he had to go back to England and ask for help. White did not exactly want the role. He had just watched his granddaughter Virginia Dare get baptised. She was only days old, the first English child born in the New World, and now he was being asked to sail away and leave her and his daughter behind. But the pressure from the settlers was heavy. On August 25th, they even wrote it down in a formal document, so there would be no doubt later. The note showed that White wasn't exactly excited about the idea. He was really just giving in, because they kept pressing him and wouldn't take no for an answer. He left his house, his art supplies, and everything he owned behind. To protect his property, the colonists promised in writing that it would stay safe until he got back. Before he left, White and the settlers set up a backup plan in case things changed while he was away. Everyone already knew Roanoke was not the best spot. Raleigh's original orders had told them to aim for Chesapeake Bay, and most of the group still hoped to move inland once they had the chance. So White made them promise that if they did leave, they would carve the name of their new location into a tree or post where it could be clearly seen. That way, he would know exactly where to find them when he returned. There was one more part to the deal though, and it showed just how uncertain everything felt. If the colonists had to move because of an attack or some kind of disaster, they were supposed to add a little Maltese cross over the letters. That small symbol would have told White that they had been forced out and not simply relocated by choice. With the plan in place, White finally sailed off on August 27th, 1587. He expected to be back by the following spring, bringing fresh supplies and maybe more settlers. But this was Roanoke, and plans had a way of falling apart fast. When John White sailed away in August 1587, he thought he would be back with food and help in just a few months. Instead, it turned into 3 long years before he ever set foot near Roanoke again. The problem wasn't laziness or poor planning. England was gearing up for a fight with Spain. The Spanish Armada, which many at the time thought could not be beaten, was preparing to attack. Queen Elizabeth ordered every English ship to stay close to home. The defence of the country came first, and that meant no free ships for John White. I can't imagine the frustration of knowing your family might be starving across the ocean, but the Navy tells you to sit tight. There was one small chance in 1588. White joined up with Sir Richard Grenville, who was supposed to take a fleet across the Atlantic. At first, things looked promising, but bad winds kept the ships stuck in port, and then Grenville was told to defend England instead of sailing for Virginia. Finally, 2 smaller ships were allowed to take White with a load of supplies. They left in April, but the whole thing fell apart. On the way out, the captains chased after Spanish ships to make money for themselves. It was a gamble that backfired. Near Morocco, French pirates attacked them, stole most of the cargo, and even left White wounded. The ships limped back to England, half empty and useless. That single failure sealed the fate of the colony for another year. Even after England beat the Armada in 1588, the war with Spain kept dragging on. Every ship was tied up with fighting or chasing treasure, and no one would take White back to Roanoke. Raleigh had already shifted his focus to Ireland, and by 1589 he handed his Virginia rights to London merchants. White even tried to hitch rides with fleets going to the West Indies, hoping they'd swing by Roanoke. But he kept getting turned down. Finally, in 1590, he got a spot on ships owned by John Watts, but even then, the owners cared more about chasing Spanish prizes than rescuing colonists. White was allowed to bring only himself and his chest, no supplies, no settlers, nothing. It was a half chance at best, but it was all he had. The sea had not been kind to them on the way in. The night before they even set foot on Roanoke, a small boat overturned in the inlet. A captain and 6 men were lost in the waves. It was the kind of loss that could have broken the spirit of the crew. But John White and Captain Cook pressed on. They had come too far to turn back now. From the deck, they tried calling out to anyone who might be listening on shore. They blew a trumpet and sang familiar English songs, hoping a voice would call back. Nothing. The next morning, they went ashore to investigate a light they thought they had seen. It turned out to be nothing more than burned grass and rotting trees. Still, they kept walking along the shoreline, and that is when they spotted something that raised their hopes. Footprints. Not animal prints, but human ones. White studied them and thought they belonged to at least 2 or 3 different people. They climbed a sandy rise, and at the very top, White saw something carved into a tree. 3 neat letters. CRO. It might not sound like much, but to him it was huge. This was exactly the signal system they had agreed on before he left, so he knew it wasn't random. Seeing those 3 letters, with no cross, filled White with relief. He knew right away what it meant. CROATOAN. That was the name of the island where their ally Manteo was from. If the colonists had gone there, maybe they would have been safe. Encouraged, White led the group to where the houses of the colony had once stood. Instead of homes, they found something that looked more like a fort. A strong wall made of thick tree trunks surrounded the site, complete with corners that stuck out so defenders could watch in every direction. Inside, the houses were gone, taken down on purpose. On one of the main posts of the wall, carved in tall, clear letters, was the full word, CROATOAN. The absence of the cross yet again was key. White even wrote later that he felt joy at that discovery. It meant the colonists had left on their own terms, not chased out by enemies. For a moment, hope felt possible. Inside the fort, they found more signs of the move. Many valuable items were gone. Yet heavy gear like cannons and iron bars were still there, scattered and even starting to get buried under weeds. This suggested the colonists had left long before and had chosen to take only what was necessary. Along the creek, they looked for the colony's boats, but none remained. The smaller cannons were gone too. It was clear that the group had sailed away with some of their equipment. White had hidden some of his own belongings years earlier in a trench, and he went to check on them. They found 5 chests, 3 of which were his. But it was a bitter sight. The chests had been dug up and broken open. His books were ripped apart, his maps and pictures ruined by rain, and his armour so rusted it was useless. It must have been a strange mix of feelings for White. On one hand, the word carved into the wood gave him a clear clue. On the other hand, his personal treasures lay in ruins and the colony was empty. He and the crew eventually decided to set sail for CROATOAN Island the very next morning. That night, though, the weather got rough. The sky went dark and the wind started blowing hard. By the time they were rowing back out to the ship, the waves were rising hard. The captain and 6 others had already died in the water the day before, and nobody wanted to repeat that. Somehow White and the others made it back to the main ship, but it took everything they had. By morning, the storm was still raging. The crew had filled casks of fresh water earlier, but they had to leave them behind, which meant no new supply to drink. White still argued they should push for CROATOAN, but trouble kept piling up. First, the anchor cable snapped, then another anchor failed to hold, nearly smashing the ship on the sandbanks. They barely made it out, but now only 1 anchor was left. White wanted to press on, but the sailors had had enough. With no water, little food and 1 anchor, they refused to risk landing. A single storm could have destroyed them. They gave up on CROATOAN and turned south to find water, but the winds blew them off course. Instead of nearby shores, they were pushed all the way toward the Azores. From there, it was a long struggle home. By late October 1590, they limped into Plymouth. More than 3 years had passed since White had left his family, and his one chance to find them had failed. That was the last time he ever tried to return to Roanoke. After that, his name mostly disappeared from history. He moved to Ireland, lived quietly in Kilmore, and sent a final letter to Richard Hakluyt in 1593. In it, he admitted he no longer had the money to keep searching. It is such a sad picture, really. A man who had once drawn maps and dreamed of colonies was now too poor to even chase after his own family. Most historians think he died in Ireland around 1606. Others kept the search alive, though. Rowley still sent ships, and there were rumours and reports for decades after. But John White himself never saw his family again, and he never found out what really happened on Roanoke Island. But if White never got his answers, did someone else come closer? Roanoke was gone, but in 1607 the English tried again. This time they built Jamestown, a settlement on the James River in Virginia, only about 100 miles north of where Roanoke had once stood. When Jamestown was set up, people thought maybe the mystery of Roanoke would finally get some answers. New settlers meant new chances to ask questions, especially with the tribes living nearby. John Smith, one of the leaders of Jamestown, was especially curious. He made it his mission to ask around whenever he could, hoping someone knew what had happened to Raleigh's people. The stories he heard were all over the place. Some groups told him about villages like Occoneechee, where men were said to be walking around in European clothes. Another place called Unknown supposedly had walled houses that looked different from the usual native villages. There was even talk of Panawicka, a settlement where more men in European dress were living. Smith did send out search parties, but each time they came back empty-handed. No lost colonists, no clear signs, just rumours that kept the hope alive. Around this time, a map copied in Jamestown, and later stolen by the Spanish, showed a spot called Pacracanic with a strange little note on it. It said, "Here remaineth 4 men clothed that came from Roanoke to Okanahawan." 4 men, still alive, still clothed like English settlers. That line must have been like dangling a carrot in front of a starving man. But then came darker news. By 1609, another story was carried across the ocean to England itself. This one claimed that Powhatan, the powerful chief in Virginia, had ordered the massacre of the Roanoke settlers years earlier. Whether this was the truth or it was merely a rumour to stir the pot, nobody really knows. The tale grew even more complicated when William Strachey, the Secretary of Jamestown, wrote his account in 1612. He said the Roanoke colonists had survived peacefully with another tribe for about 20 years. According to him, Powhatan later attacked them after his priests warned him to strike. Strachey claimed that 7 people escaped the slaughter, including 4 men, 2 boys, and 1 woman. They supposedly ran up the Chowan River and ended up under the protection of a chief named Roanoke. There they were said to be beating copper at a place called Roanoke. Powhatan himself added fuel to the fire. He reportedly told John Smith straight out that he had been at the massacre and even showed off items he said belonged to the colonists, like a musket barrel and a brass mortar. And honestly, Powhatan had every reason to bluff. Telling Smith he had already destroyed the Roanoke colony could have been a way to scare him off or make himself look stronger. Some argue that the settlers lived on through their children in native communities. Others think Powhatan's story of a massacre was the closest thing to the truth. All of it leaves just enough room to keep the mystery alive. But if Powhatan's story didn't add up, then who else could have taken out the colonists? If you line up the theories about what happened to the Roanoke colony, the idea of a Spanish attack is one of the louder ones. And honestly, given the tension at the time, it doesn't sound too far-fetched. In the 1580s, England and Spain weren't just rivals, they were bitter enemies. England was Protestant under Queen Elizabeth I, and Spain was Catholic under King Philip II. Religion was a huge deal back then, and so was power. Every little outpost, every stretch of coast, was seen as a piece of the bigger chessboard. For Spain, North America was already theirs in their eyes. So when a group of English settlers suddenly planted themselves right on Roanoke, close to Spanish shipping routes, it wasn't just a minor annoyance. It looked like an English military base hiding as a colony. And the Spanish had a track record for dealing with threats. Just a couple of decades earlier, they wiped out the French Huguenot settlement at Fort Caroline. No hesitation. They sent soldiers, and the French didn't stand a chance. So, when the Roanoke colony showed up, some argue Spain would have seen it the same way. A trespass that needed to be stamped out. Here's where timing makes it tricky. When John White got stuck for 3 years during the Anglo-Spanish War, the colonists were on their own, cut off and very vulnerable. If Spain had wanted to move in, that was the perfect window, and Spain was paying close attention. They had spies and informants keeping tabs on what England was doing. In 1587, they even captured an English sailor who spilled the news about the Roanoke colony. King Philip II responded by sending Vicente Gonzalez to check it out. Gonzalez sailed north in 1588, and he came across Port Ferdinando, which had clear signs of English activity. But by the time he got there, it looked empty, and he left without pressing further. Was he cautious, or did he just underestimate how important the place was? Hard to say. Some believe the Spanish were gearing up for an attack, but pulled back once they realised the settlement wasn't as threatening as they thought. Others point to records showing Spain was still snooping around the Chesapeake Bay as late as 1600. But what if Spain wasn't the real threat? Maybe the colonists didn't need an enemy at all. Maybe nature itself was enough. From the very beginning, the Roanoke colony was in trouble. Their supplies were low, and right off the bat, a huge portion of their food was ruined when their ship ran aground. That single accident cut into what they had to live on, and they were already in no position to take big hits like that. So they leaned on the nearby indigenous tribes, hoping for trade. But nature had other plans. A drought hit in 1587, and it didn't let up for 3 years straight. Crops shriveled, streams dried, and even the Algonquian people were struggling to feed their own families. Trading away food to strangers was the last thing on their minds. Now add in the timing. Governor John White left for England that same year, promising to bring back supplies. But because of the war with Spain, he got stuck there for 3 whole years. That delay sealed the colony's fate. The settlers had to figure things out on their own, and they weren't exactly farmers with years of experience. Most were craftsmen, soldiers, or people who'd never lived off the land like that before. Survival skills don't just appear out of thin air. With over 100 people stuck on an island and no food coming in, it doesn't take a historian to guess what happened. Many believe they likely starved, got sick, and died in groups. Disease always followed hunger back then. Malnutrition weakens your body, and once that happens, infections sweep through like wildfire. It is argued that most of the 117 settlers likely died this way, quietly, with no battle, no drama, just the slow grind of famine and illness. There's a twist to all this that keeps everyone second guessing. When John White finally came back in 1590, he didn't find graves, bones, or even the chaos you'd expect after a collapse. Instead, the fort was dismantled, like people had taken it apart with their own hands. That detail made some wonder if the survivors scattered, maybe in small, desperate groups, or if they did things so extreme that the evidence vanished. Which brings us to the darker spin on this theory: cannibalism. When humans are pushed past the edge, hunger drives them to horrifying choices. Folklore hints at this, and survival logic supports it. Some say the colonists may have turned on each other, fighting over scraps and even killing to eat. Others stretch the theory further, suggesting hostile groups could have killed them and used their remains in rituals or medicine. There's even a paranormal angle here, tied to native stories about the Wendigo, a spirit said to take over anyone who eats human flesh. If you believe that, the idea of cursed settlers still roaming the woods starts to make sense. And if cannibalism sounds too extreme to take seriously, history gives us a pretty grim example. About 20 years later in Jamestown, another English colony went through what they called the starving time in 1609. That winter was so harsh that they ate whatever they could find: horses, dogs, cats, rats, even old leather shoes. And when that wasn't enough, they even dug up graves. The governor at the time was George Percy, a nobleman from England who had taken charge of Jamestown. And he wrote it all down. He even described how one man killed and salted his own pregnant wife before being caught and executed. That's not just a rumour either. Archaeologists in 2012 uncovered the remains of a 14-year-old girl they called Jane. Her skull and bones had cut marks, the kind you'd see when someone with no butchering skills tries to get meat from bone. The evidence proved the colonists really had eaten human flesh to survive. So if Jamestown, with its stronger backing and more resources, reached that point, what does that say about Roanoke, left alone in the middle of a drought? It makes the starvation theory hard to dismiss. And the cannibalism angle, while disturbing, doesn't feel impossible once you see what desperate people in similar situations were willing to do. CROATOAN, that single word carved into the post, is what really kicked this off. It looks simple on its own, but people have treated it almost like a cursed word. Over the years, it's popped up in other weird places. Edgar Allan Poe supposedly had the word scribbled in his belongings just before his death. Sailors on the ghost ship Carroll A. Deering wrote it in their logbook before the whole crew disappeared. I don't know about you, but when a word keeps showing up next to stories of people vanishing, I start raising an eyebrow. The CROATOAN people themselves had deep-rooted beliefs about spirits tied to the land. One story says the island had a powerful spirit that could absorb humans into nature itself. So instead of the colonists vanishing, some say they actually became part of the earth. They might have turned into trees, animals, or even rocks. Then there's the story of the reptilian devil of the woods. People said it was a spirit that could slip inside you and twist who you were. It thrived on fear, greed, and violence. If the settlers were already nervous after John White left, running into something like that could have pushed them over the edge. Under its influence, they might have turned on each other until everything collapsed. Witches come into the story too. The CROATOAN people believed in witchcraft, and witches were said to bring sickness, bad luck, and harm. Some legends claim the settlers were blamed for this and punished. Others flip it, saying the settlers stumbled across witches already living in the woods, and that encounter didn't end well. We can't prove any of it, but the idea of running into a hidden coven out there is the kind of story that sticks. The show American Horror Story dedicated an entire season to it, painting the colonists as a ghostly army bound to the land by a curse. In that version, a woman called the Butcher slaughters the colonists, and their spirits stick around to terrorize anyone who steps into their territory. Other shows and books have used the word CROATOAN as a symbol of vanishings, with people whispering it before disappearing, or being dragged off by some unseen force. There are even whispers about Queen Elizabeth's advisor, John Dee, who is rumoured to dabble in sorcery. Some believe he experimented with powerful rituals, and Roanoke could have been a part of that. There's one more theory that people don't talk about as much, but it might be the most believable. There's another side of the Roanoke mystery that doesn't lean on ghosts at all. Instead, it says the whole thing was covered up on purpose. Not by nature, not by bad luck, but by powerful people who wanted to save face. In the late 1500s, England was in a tight race with Spain. Spain had its treasure fleets and colonies, and England wanted to show it could do the same. So Walter Raleigh was the man leading that push. He wanted Roanoke to prove England's strength in the New World and to set up bases for raiding Spanish ships. But if news got out that the colony had flopped, it would have been humiliating. Who would trust England to handle new settlements if the very first one fell apart? So, some argue that Raleigh and the Crown found it much easier to spin the story into a mystery than to admit defeat. Raleigh kept claiming rights to Virginia until 1603, which only worked if he could say the colony wasn't gone for good. As long as the fate of the settlers stayed up in the air, he could argue they might still be alive somewhere, which gave him a legal reason to hold on to the land. When Raleigh later got tangled in a plot against King James and was locked up for treason, he lost everything, including those rights. That alone shows how much these colonial claims were tied to politics and reputation, not just survival. Remember, Governor John White mentioned that the colonists planned to move about 50 miles further inland. That line didn't seem like much at the time, but centuries later, researchers looking at White's own map found something strange. At the British Museum, under a patch of paper glued onto the map, scientists spotted a faint symbol using X-ray tech. It looked like a little fort drawn near where the Roanoke and Chowan rivers meet, the same 50 miles White had written about. Why cover up a fort? One explanation is that White or someone else didn't want Spain to know about a hidden English base in the region. If that was true, the colony may not have been lost at all. It could have been relocated in secret as part of a military plan. And if the fort actually existed, it means the whole vanishing story was less about mystery and more about protecting a classified outpost. It doesn't end there. Anthropologist Lee Miller suggested that the colonists weren't just unlucky, but were pawns in a political game. She believes Sir Francis Walsingham, one of Queen Elizabeth's closest advisors, had a hand in stranding the colonists at Roanoke. The idea was that by undercutting Raleigh, who was a favourite of the Queen, Walsingham could push his own vision for Protestant power abroad. It's a bold claim, but when you look at how ruthless Elizabethan politics were, I wouldn't put it past them. People were constantly scheming, and colonial projects weren't just about survival, they were tools in power struggles back home. So while the spooky stories and conspiracies grab attention, researchers often push back. They say the real answer was probably far more practical. There's one explanation that researchers actually back with solid evidence. It isn't about cover-ups, curses, or vanishing into thin air. It's about something much simpler. The colonists didn't die off or get wiped out. They joined their neighbours, the CROATOAN people, and became part of their community. It made sense too. Roanoke Island wasn't exactly a great spot for survival. The soil wasn't good for farming, and the settlers were already struggling to get enough food. On top of that, relations with some local tribes like the CROATOANs were turning hostile. One of the colonists, George Howe, was killed not long before White sailed back to England. Compare that to the CROATOANs, who were known to be friendly, and it doesn't take much to see why the colonists would pack up and move. But the real proof doesn't come until later, more than 100 years after the colony disappeared. Between 1701 and 1709, explorer John Lawson travelled through North Carolina and spent time with the Hatteras people, who were descendants of the CROATOAN. They told him something surprising. They said some of their ancestors were white, and Lawson noticed something strange too. A lot of them had grey or blue eyes. That's not something you'd normally find in Native American groups at the time. And Lawson wrote that these traits were common among them, but not among other tribes. Even more interesting, the Hatteras remembered that their ancestors could speak out of a book. That sounds a lot like they were recalling English settlers who knew how to read. Lawson walked away convinced. To him, it was obvious. The colonists hadn't disappeared at all. They had blended into the CROATOAN tribe and kept some of their ways alive. And he wasn't the last person to believe it. In the 1800s, native communities in Robeson County now known as the Lumbee tribe, claimed they were descended from both the CROATOAN and the Roanoke colonists. They pointed to their lighter skin, their blue eyes, and even family names that matched the names of the colonists. Visitors in the 19th century also noted that some of these groups still used old-fashioned English words that had faded out in England. Words like mon for man and father for father, which sounded more like Shakespeare's time than the 1800s. That's not something you'd just make up. That's the kind of thing that gets passed down through generations. Of course, stories are one thing. Archaeology is another. And in this case, the digging actually lines up. On Hatteras Island, archaeologists like Mark Horton and the CROATOAN Archaeological Society found layer after layer of artifacts that told a story of two cultures living side by side. They dug up thousands of items that weren't just traded goods. They showed real day-to-day life between the English and the CROATOAN. One of the most convincing finds was tiny bits of iron called hammer scale. Local tribes didn't have the kind of furnaces needed for that, so this pointed straight to the presence of English settlers setting up a workshop right in the village. And the artifacts kept telling the same story. Pieces of guns, bits of European pottery, metal tips from clothing, and even a fragment of a rapier sword all turned up in the same soil layers as native pottery and arrowheads. The mixing wasn't accidental. It showed people living together, not just trading once in a while. They even found construction traces that stood out. Big square post holes, the kind you'd see in English houses sitting right alongside the round ones from native longhouses. The details of their life together showed up in smaller ways too. Archaeologists found pig teeth from animals that clearly weren't native to the area. Generations of pigs were being raised, which means the settlers brought livestock traditions with them. They also found English items that had been cleverly adapted. Earrings turned into fish hooks, and gun barrels were cut into tools for tapping tar out of trees. That's people not just surviving, but inventing and adjusting together. As for the theory that Spain wiped out the Roanoke colony, it does sound believable at first. England and Spain were enemies, and Spain had the ships and soldiers to make it happen. Knocking out a small English outpost in their claimed territory would have been an easy win. But here is where the history gets a little tricky. According to the records we do have, Spain definitely knew the colony was there. Their spies had told them about it. They even made a few notes in their reports about this odd little English group camped out on the coast. But here is the key thing. They never followed up. Not a single Spanish document has ever shown a clear order or mission to go wipe out Roanoke. And trust me, Spain was obsessed with writing everything down. Their captains kept logs, their governors filed reports. If they had destroyed the colony, there would be some trace of it in those mountains of paperwork. Now add this. Spanish patrols in the area were busy with other problems. They were stretched thin defending their treasure fleets. Pirates were a nightmare for them. And of course, the war with England was heating up in Europe. If you were a Spanish commander, you had way bigger fires to put out than a handful of settlers scraping by on a swampy island. Some historians also point out something else that just does not line up. When John White returned in 1590 and found the colony gone, he reported no signs of a battle. No burned homes, no broken weapons. Nothing screamed that this place had been attacked. If the Spanish had hit the settlement, they would have left a mark. Spain's style of warfare at the time was not subtle. They burned villages to the ground. They made examples out of people. Roanoke showed none of that. It was just empty. Here is the real problem with Roanoke. The evidence just is not there. That is what makes it so frustrating. The moment you try to pin down what happened, the trail falls apart. Archaeology should help, but it only gives us fragments. A few bits of pottery, some tools, nothing that clearly tells the story. It is like trying to put together a puzzle when most of the pieces are missing. The land itself makes things worse. The soil on the coast eats away wood, cloth, and even bones. If the colonists built houses or left anything behind, nature probably wiped it clean long ago. So what we are left with is not a full picture, just scattered hints. And that is why the mystery has lasted so long. There is enough to keep people guessing, but never enough to settle the question.